And we're back again. It's a new day, and I will admit I've been churning away overnight just to get these ports done. So obviously I've all done the bridges, you understand the process there. Now what I'm going to show you is a couple of things that you have to do additionally with a Bridgeport, particularly on a 231 engine or a 6-port. So I mentioned a relief cut in the housing before to accommodate the bridge, and what I mean by that is these bits here. The process of marking it is quite simple, and I'll show you just how to do that. First, what you want to do is establish which housing is front and which one is rear. Now, I've already done the front one, so it's safe to assume this is going to be the rear. Now, what you want to do is, on the intake area of the housing, you want to mark just along the edge with either the engineer's blue or whatever you prefer to use. A marker pen is absolutely fine, just as long as you can see when you've scribed into it. Not only do you mark the face of the housing, you also mark the side, just on the inside of where the water seal will sit, so just along this edge here. And you do this for both sides, like I said. This will all make sense pretty soon. So with the housings now marked, we now have to get the corresponding irons, put them down, and then get the dowels, put them together. And from that point on, you will be able to see where the housing meets the bridge. So we want the back side of the center iron, as it's for the rear housing. Slide it down, and then you will see exactly where to make your mark. So let's get our little scribe and make the relevant mark. Because of the angle, it's not going to be perfect, obviously, making the mark, but it's a point of reference for where you want to be cutting the chamfer more than anything else. With the housing now marked, take it off, set the iron out of the way, and there you have it. It may not be particularly clear on camera, but there are 2 marks there. With that in mind, let's make a little scribe here, just so we know exactly where we're porting. We now know where to port on the housing, great. But before we do, we need a point of reference of how deep we cut the port as well. So we grab our vernier caliper once again. As a rough figure, I tend to do a depth of about 3mm on the primary ridges, and then slightly less on the secondary and auxiliary bridge. You can go as deep as you dare technically, but the benefit isn't really there per se. Once again, we get into the realms of trade-offs. Going too big isn't necessarily better. It's all about velocity. All these sorts of things are a factor in these ports. So without further ado, I've got my vernier set at 3mm, and I'm going to make the scribe along the housing face. Just simply grab the verniers and scratch into the mark. It does help if you know just how far the bridge goes into the water area. My Bridgeports are 5mm. Generally speaking, it's about 3mm towards the inner edge and then 2mm to the combustion chamber. So it's safe to assume that 3mm is all you'll need on this relief cut. The mark has been made, so all that's left to do is port it. Okay, so that's pretty much the process of the cut. Always make sure once you've made the cut that obviously it lines up with the hole that you've got on the irons. So, same process as before. Get your housing, get your iron, put a dowel through the two of them, and just see where it lines up. From top to bottom, pretty nice. So just a little bit of finishing to do on that. But that is essentially all you've got to do. It's not a particularly tedious process, it's quite straightforward, but because aluminium is so easy to cut through with a die grinder, it's something you should take your time with for sure. I'm pretty happy with that, just a little bit of refinement to do, and then I'll move on to the auxiliary and secondaries, but you've seen the process. But whilst I'm here, 6 ports. On the lower intake manifold, you have these auxiliary port sleeves. Now, obviously they're port matched to a standard port. If you do a street port and a bridge port, you've got to take into consideration that these also need porting. So it's already been port matched to a street port, hence the cut up here. After you've cut the bridge, you've also got to insert the sleeves. You've got to mark it up first, but insert the sleeves. And as you can see here, I've already put a marking here to show where I need to make the cut. Once you've made the cut, it will look a bit like this. You can literally put a bridge cut in there, so you can leave a bit of this material in, but I don't in particular. I don't see the point. It doesn't really, there is no benefit to it. And this just ensures that you've got good airflow all the way in through the sleeve to both ports. Well, we've got through all of the porting now. Thankfully, I mean, it's tedious, it's bullshit to be honest, but hey, it's all in the pursuit of power, amongst other things. But onto the rebuild now. I always start with the bearings, just because you can't put the seals in rotors before you put the bearings in. It's just backwards, because it means putting it into a press, which I will show you. First, I want to talk about the rear stationary gears on these engines. Now, a little known secret amongst builders, or certainly amongst my circle anyway, the rear gears have a bit of a flaw. And on these other gears, that is very apparent. I'll show you just how consistently poor this is from Mazda. If I put this gear down, this is the gear that's going into the current engine that I'm building. If you have a good look at the oil ports here, this comes directly from the oil filter pedestal, well, on the Series 1s. But it comes from the rear iron, it goes down the channel, and essentially this is what feeds the bearing. Now, these have a misaligned hole, and this is a flaw even from new. Even on a brand new crate engine, this will always be apparent. It's just part of the casting. It's definitely an error on Mazda's part, but thankfully it can be corrected just via means as simple as porting. It doesn't take very long. It's in terms of matching it up to the port. If you're rebuilding an existing engine, this is usually very apparent. These are 3 231 gears. Essentially, they're my spares. These are things that I put into 192 engines just because they're cold case hardened, and this is the same for the front gear as well. It's an ideal upgrade if you're going to be revving it quite high, quite regularly, as it maintains its structure. It can cope with the abuse. But more to the point, back on track. If you look at these oil ports here, one thing you'll notice amongst all 3 of them is this dark coloration here. This dark coloration is caused by oil hitting the gear just because of the poor matching of the holes. It's mismatched, it's not casted correctly, it's not machined properly, or however it's done in Mazda. But it's ideal for us because it acts as a template in terms of where to port, which is nice. It makes it a lot easier. I kind of know it off by heart now. It's usually offset to the 7 o'clock position if you stand the gear up like this. But yeah, as I say, not too bad to correct. Something that you can easily do with a Dremel, and it's definitely worthwhile if you want an engine to last and to, I guess, ultimately reduce the chances of rear bearing failure or rear gear failure, anything like that. It's ideal. Definitely keep that one in your notebook for sure. But as I said, I've already done the work on this gear. I've already put a new bearing in as well, so it's perfect. It's ready to go in. But I will show you how to press the bearings in old bearing out and new bearing in on this front gear here. Nice and clean, ready to go. Let's move over to the press. First things first, 231 gear. They always have a retainer screw in them, and REWs are exactly the same, to be fair. So, simply put, flat blade screwdriver, preferably one that fits really well into the screw, and just unwind it. Just like that. So, generally speaking, you can unwind it all the way, but I always seem to lose them, so I leave them in. And then once you've pressed the old bearing out, press the new one in, you can reapply the lock-in compound onto the screw just so it won't wiggle its way out, which it shouldn't do. I've never had that issue before, but it's something that's specified in the manual, so therefore we have to adhere to it. So with the screw now wound out, stick it on this little thing here. Okay, it's in position on the press now. And just rewind it a little bit. Grab your bearing press tool. You can get these from most rotary shops anyway. This is a Pineapple Racing one. I have no idea if you can get them anymore, for reasons that you'll probably know, but essentially anything that's been designed specifically for these bearings would be ideal. Leave a little space for the bearing to actually go through as you're pressing it out. And as a general rule of thumb, just because there's a bit of a taper on the gear side of the on the toothed side of the gear, I start there whether I'm pressing a bearing out or pressing one in. So let's go ahead and press it out. Be ready to catch it on its way out. There you go. One stationary gear bearing. I mean, there isn't really anything wrong with it, as you can probably expect with an engine of this sort of mileage, but we do good things around here. We replace stuff, we replace as much as we can. Grab yourself some brake cleaner and a rag, clean the inside of the gear. Definitely clean it. So with that clean now, just stick that there for the time being, and I will show you how to line things up. I'ma teach you how to smile, baby. Oh. So when it comes to the stationary gear bearings, there's only one size I go for, and it's the biggest you can get. And this applies to the rotors as well. The NF0110E04s are marked yellow. They're the biggest ones you can get. And the reason why we go big is because for those who spend a lot of their time in the higher part of the rev range, you want as much clearance as possible for the oil to take up the space, under high pressure obviously. And this creates what's known as a boundary layer. This boundary layer is ultimately the layer of oil that prevents bearing and shaft contact, which is obviously ideal. You want as much support as you can get. I've never really had any issues with it. In fact, I've never had an issue with yellow bearings at all, unless unless the rotating assembly was out of balance, like severely, which I'll talk about very soon. So yeah, yellow bearings. So on to the actual topic at hand. Lining these up, there's two ways you can go about it. You can either scribe the bearing to line up with something like the screw or the oil port, whichever. But if you're like me and you just want to crack on with things, you can line them up by eye. It's not terribly hard to do, and you can usually use both as a point of reference for alignment. School time with Josh. As I mentioned, stopper screw, that's one alignment mark, and on the other side you've got the oil port. The oil port wants to match this hole here, the biggest one that they have on the bearing. That's actually where your oil comes through. And the hole that's the most opposite, which is the one with this convenient little line here, that aligns with the stopper screw. So with that in mind, I usually have the stopper screw facing me, just because it's easier to see than the oil port on the other side. And I basically, with the paint facing down, because that's where it's meant to be, just align both holes. So that's somewhere near. Little tip, use the gap between the teeth to help you as well. And then for the most part, just make sure it's somewhere near straight, which is where this taper on the gear side helps a lot. Once it's in, just verify that it's nice and flat, which it isn't yet. There we go. It usually just pops into place. And that's about there. Once you've done that, bring it back to the press. I cannot stress this enough, start from the gear side. It just helps keep things nice and easy for yourself. And don't be afraid to make little tweaks last minute. I'm not teaching anyone to suck eggs here. This is just, I'm trying to be as informative as I can. So just before the press hits the bearing, just once again verify that things are as straight as they can possibly be, and slowly engage. You want to make sure that the bearing itself isn't kinked or, doing anything wobbly on the way down. If it does, it's only for a brief moment before it truly straightens itself out, but if you're going from the back, it's hard to go wrong, if I'm honest. If you're wondering when to stop, you don't actually have to be too conscious about how far you've gone through. I tend to stop about this point, just where the taper of the race kind of starts showing. So release the pressure, flip it upside down, and what you will see is it's poked through, no drama. If you have the correct rotary bearing tool, it should come with a separate race. And this separate race simply acts as an extension, I guess. You've still got this part which ultimately goes in the bearing, but this race here, this prevents you from pressing it all the way through. So let's get that in there. Take a bit of length out of there, stick it back in, and press it. Press it till it stops. And there we go, that's stopped. You've installed a bearing successfully. Now the last thing to do, as I mentioned before, you take the retaining screw out, reapply Loctite, screw it back in nice and tight. Don't have to go too mad, but if you go too tight, you are just gonna knacker the screw basically. So yeah, that's where the Loctite comes in handy. I go with green just simply because it has a bit more bite than blue and it is chemical resistant. So things like oils and all that poses no threat. And in she goes. Now, the fun part, rotors. Pressing the bearings in is pretty much the starting point. Like I said before, you can't press anything into these when you've got seals in them. So, start with the bearings. But before I get on with that, let me talk to you a little bit about balancing. So, balancing in the rotary world, there's been a lot of talk about it recently, especially in regards to should you lighten them and should you clearance them and things like that. Now, there's a few things you want to be thinking about in regards to this. So, how's the car going to be used? Is it going to be a daily driver, a weekend sender, or is it ultimately going to be a dedicated track car? Now, let's have a bit of a background story. So Mazda, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the casting was so good on the Renesys rotors that they didn't actually need any balancing. That is a load of shit. Yes, the casting methods did definitely improve over the years, and it was a milestone with the Renesys that it came out quite consistent. However, time has proven that with the experience of other builders around the world, that is not the case. The balancing is pretty far out, and with anything that is cast, there's going to be some imperfections in terms of the actual casting inside the rotors. So one corner might be heavier than the other, or something along those lines. It's the same story with a piston engine. Yes, you can cast exactly the same sort of piston, but ultimately you are going to have to balance it in conjunction with your counterweights, etc., etc. Now, there's two aspects of balancing on a rotor. You've got to consider the actual physical objects, but you also have to consider the oil, the fluid movement from inside as well. When you're spinning at 9,000 RPM, even a few grams of imbalance can cause quite a lot of imbalance when you account for the rotational force as well. This is why we should always balance. This is something I do outsource. I will say there's very few people in the UK that actually know what they're doing. There's only one guy I trust with the balancing, and that's Colin from Garage Reg. There is no one who has put more effort into R&D with the rotaries than Colin. And this has been proven with various drag racing engines that he's built, high performance engines. I think he still holds the record for the most powerful 13B in the UK. On pump fuel, may I add. Back to balancing. RX-8 rotors, they do still need balancing, especially if you have an aftermarket flywheel. Just because the counterbalance that goes on the flywheel usually needs quite a bit of correcting. It throws things off by a considerable margin more often than not. So just bear that in mind. So here we've got a regular rotor and a balanced rotor. Everyone has their preferred method when it comes to balancing. You've got the type of balancing where you just simply remove relevant weight from the relevant corners of the rotor, as well as adding or removing weight from the counterweights. Now, as I said before, Mazda didn't do anything with the rotors, which is part of the problem. Yes, they vary in weight, which is noted with the stamps on each rotor. So you've got weights ranging from A to E. And for the most part, you can get away with just pairing up the rotors with the relevant letter. So if you've got a C rotor like this one here, you pair it up with another C rotor. You can apparently go one way or the other, so you can match a B with a C or a D with a C, that sort of thing. You get the picture. But I tend not to. I try to keep them as close together as possible in terms of weight, so match the letters up. This is only part of the story. But as you can see here, the corners have been machined in different depths to balance the actual rotor itself, kind of even out the weight on all sides. The benefit to all this, the engine revs freer. It doesn't have any weird forces that counteract the movement or throw the movement out, so to speak. This in turn helps prolong the life of the bearings. It significantly reduces the chance of bearing to E-shaft contacts, and this is throughout the engine as well. It also reduces the chance of the rotor itself physically touching parts of the engine, so the irons, the housings and all that sort of stuff. Because on some engines that have had a bit of a harder life than others, you tend to see some strike marks on the corners. Now that moves me on to a couple of other things as well when considering building an engine. Clearancing, side clearancing, all that sort of stuff. This is simply where you remove material from the parts that stick out the most on the engine. So you've got these side parts here. So that includes the sides of the rotor, where the corner seals are particularly, just because if you do have a bit of a wiggle at high RPM, these corners are going to be the first parts that touch the irons, which isn't great. Obviously, it means that the irons are going to wear out, which in turn wears out your side seals. Not ideal. The other aspect to clearancing as well is the actual rotor face. Now, similar concept, you can actually machine these edges as well, which particularly reduces the chance of contact against a housing. Now, the combustion area, which is where the spark plugs are, this is where most of the magic happens. This is what propels the rotor to spin in the direction that it does. If there's enough force there and certainly enough speed and enough imbalance, this can cause the rotor to catch. And then obviously at that sort of speed, it's not ideal. It can affect other things. For road going purposes, you can make do with just balancing. Balancing is so critical, not just on rotaries, but any engine. And it's something I tend to recommend on anyone's engine that's going to see a lot of hard use. You know, hitting a red line a day keeps the carbon away and all that sort of stuff. That's why it's encouraged that people rev these. They redline them every time they get out in them and stuff. Carbon is the least of your worries, to be honest with you. It's definitely more about keeping bearing wear to a minimum, as well as physical wear on the engine components itself. But I've babbled on enough, right? Let's progress with getting this pressed out. Right, similar to before, same tool, just a different attachment. This one is suited for rotor bearings. And much like with the gears, you want to be starting from the back of the bearing, rear facing side of the rotor. And this is determined by the teeth. The teeth are always on the front of the rotor. If you press from the front, you're gonna score the race, and no one wants that. Obviously, that means the rotor is potentially dead. So we start from the back always. So let's place that down. To make things quicker, I'm just gonna put this here just to extend the shaft a little bit. There we go. Lock it off and send it away. Can't really get it wrong when you're pressing it out, that's for sure. Once again, get ready to catch the bearing as it comes through. One rotor bearing. And let's go to the table where I'll show you a little bit more. N3A1s. These are by far the best rotor bearings you can get. And the only reason why I say that is because of exactly the same reasons why I stick with yellows on the stationary gear bearings as well. They offer the most bearing clearance. And I'm gonna say everyone uses them. Absolutely everyone uses them. Particularly these ones offer the most clearance, and it's actually just a touch above what they come with from factory, which are the N3A2s. These are green marked. You will always, I say always, these are what you tend to see when you strip an engine, on a 231 at least. These are a tiny bit trickier to put in, but not by much, provided you take the correct precautions and things like that. Post removal, obviously, once again, wipe the inside of the bearing. So I'm going to grab the brake cleaner that fell off. Two things. Grab yourself a scribe and grab yourself one of these. This is, I think they call it a set square, can't remember. The most important part is it has a right angle in it. This is great for just referencing a straight line against a bearing. All you have to do is line it up against this tab. This is going to be a point of reference for where you press it in. So line it up against the tab, nice and straight, and just simply put a line into the bearing. Do this on both sides, just so you can reference where left and right is, how central it is, etc. So you have two lines. That area is going to be where you want to aim when you're pressing this into the rotor, and I will show you. That tab is where you want the notch in your bearing to fall into. Those two lines that I mentioned on the bearing, You just want to line up with that. Nice and easy, right? A little pro tip, you can use these two teeth for alignment as well. It tends to fall between them. And if you keep that in mind, you can't really go wrong. So that's now in place. You just want to make sure that the bearing is level with the rotor. And this is something that you confirm visually. Just get down to the level of the rotor, and provided it's relatively straight, you can proceed to press it in. Carefully place the tool on top. Line it up. And there you go, line it up with the press. Same procedure again, just get it down nice and slow. Go real slow. Make sure that it doesn't kink when you press it right down. It may do a tiny little kink just to align itself, and then it will just pop into its path. And for reference, if it is starting to kink quite significantly, stop. Start again. It's not worth the risk. Release the pressure. So the bearing's about 80% of the way there. Like before, grab your sleeve, stick the sleeve on and put it in place. This ensures that you don't overstep the mark when you're pressing it, because if you go beyond its natural position, you run the risk of bending that tab the way that you do not want to. Press it till it stops. Release the pressure. And away you go. How's that for alignment? So yeah, as I said, you can't really go wrong if you mark it and reference all your points. Pro tip, all this Babbitt material that seems to have come off the bearing, you want to remove as much of that as you can. Now, you'll probably have to scratch it off with a pick and then use compressed air to blow it off, but yes, you don't want that in the engine. It's what we class as foreign material, and foreign material is bad. But yes, that is essentially what it means to press a bearing in.